So welcome YouTube to the True Dialogue Show here on the AIP TV channel. Be sure to like and subscribe to this content so you can follow more. Today I have a very special guest that I'm very honored to have. I have Professor Gerald Horne joining me today. Professor Horne is a Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His research addresses issues of racism in a myriad of ways involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. Dr. Horne received his PhD in history from Columbia University and his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his BA from Princeton University. Dr. Horne is the author of more than 30 books and 100 scholarly articles and reviews. And today's topic, Paul Robeson, which is the subject of his book, Paul Robeson, the Artist as Revolutionary. And Professor Horne will put a graphic of the title of the cover of the book so the audience can see the book. And I definitely recommend that those in the audience go out and buy the book and read it. It's definitely a great read. So Paul Robeson, the artist is revolutionary. So that's what will be the topic of what we're talking about today. And so I want to get started, Dr. Horne, sort of speaking about Paul Robeson. You mentioned in the book that Paul Robeson was a forerunner for Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King, and you can't understand the trajectory of these two men without understanding the life of Paul Robeson. He was a militant. He was a Marxist, he was a Pan-Africanist, he was a star athlete. He was also an actor and a singer. Additionally, he was multilingual and he had a law degree from Columbia University. And even W.E.B. Du Bois said he's without a doubt the best known American on earth. So clearly what I got from reading your book is Paul Robeson was definitely a multi-talented man. Could you speak more about who Paul Robeson was and the talents he had as an individual?
Well, thank you for inviting me. Paul Robeson was born in central New Jersey circa 1898, passing away in Philadelphia in 1976. In between, as you suggest, he was a star athlete at Rutgers University. Although he grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, that Jim Crow institution did not allow him to be admitted into their Ivy League hollowed walls. So he went to the State University in New Brunswick, where he starred in football and basketball and baseball and track and field. From there, as you suggested, was on to law school. And it seemed as if he was on a path to middle-class respectability. But a number of fortuitous events intervened. And one is that he met the woman who would become his wife, Osunlade Robeson, who, as you may know, has also been the subject of biographical treatment because of her star wattage. And it was Osunlade Robeson who encouraged him to pursue the arts, to pursue a career as an actor and a singer, which he proceeded to do. But he decided to decamp to London, where he spent most of the 1920s and the 1930s, where he achieved a certain kind of fame and stardom, particularly playing Othello, Shakespeare's premier tragedy, and also becoming a star in cinema as well. But what happens is that a friend from his US life, speaking of William L. Patterson, who was also a Black lawyer, I've subjected William L. Patterson as well to biographical treatment. And it was Patterson who encouraged Robeson to move to the left. This was happening in the 1930s in the context of the Scottsboro case. You may recall that case of 9 Black youth in Alabama who were accused falsely and maliciously of sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women, are headed, like so many Black men before and since, to execution before Patterson, in league with the US Communist Party and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and communist parties all over the world, quite frankly, create a worldwide movement with the Scottsboro Nine as the symbols. And what that does is that it creates an international movement against US apartheid, against US Jim Crow. A part of the key to understanding the United States, particularly as it pertains to Black people, is that oftentimes it has required an international movement. For example, in my book on the Haitian Revolution, I talk about how that penultimate event, 1791 to 1804, a revolt of the enslaved that was successful, created a general crisis of the entire slave system, including the United States, that led to its collapse in 1865. And by the 1930s, the Scottsboro case was illustrating once again the necessity for international solidarity in order for the United States to be moved in a humane and progressive direction. So it was through the tutelage and the encouragement of Patterson that Robeson began to move to the left. He also visits Germany at the time when fascism is rising, and that has a dramatic impact on him. He also visits the former Soviet Union, and as you suggested in your opening remarks, Robeson was multilingual, and he spoke fluent Russian, which gave an insight into that nation. I should mention parenthetically that Russia is a rather unique European nation in the sense that the father of the Russian language is a man of African descent, speaking of Pushkin, that as Western European nations such as Britain and France were becoming fat and wealthy on the African slave trade and the exploited labor of enslaved Africans, as they were moving west across the Atlantic to exploit the Americas and south to Africa, Russia was moving east. If you want to track a path of exploitation for Russia, it would not be south towards Africa, it would be east across Asia. Vladivostok, Russia's window on the Pacific, was only established circa 1860. So in any case, Russia did not have the rather dire and drastic and ghoulish history with Black people that many of the Western European nations did, and Robeson felt quite comfortable in Russia. And of course, you had the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, which was an important event as Russia leads the world in moving planet Earth towards a class project. Recall that before 1492, a major marker and point of division before Columbus's rampaging through the Americas was the question of religion, the question of Christians versus Muslims, particularly the Ottoman Turks, who were considered to be quite fearsome. And then 1517, you have Martin Luther and the secession from the Catholic Church of those we call Protestants. And of course, there's anti-Semitism as well, anti-Jewish fervor. What happens with Columbus is that that's the onset of what I call the race project, where race is used as a way to distinguish and divide and ultimately pulverize Africans for the wealth of slavery and the slave trade. As I suggested, the Haitian Revolution disrupts that pattern. And then by 1917, you have the onset of the class project, where you have the growth of socialist movements, not least in Africa and the Caribbean. So this was the environment in which Robeson was moving to the left in the 1930s, and he might have spent the rest of his life and career in London. But what happens, as you probably know, is that in 1939, a war erupts on the European continent. Robeson is concerned that he and his family would be trapped behind enemy lines. And you may have seen, or your audience may have seen, some of the footage from the Germans bombing Britain during World War II. I mean, people were sleeping in subways. It was quite horrific. And so Robeson decides to come back to the United States, which is a turning point. To begin with, that did not seem as it was a major matter because, as your comment from Du Bois suggested, he had a certain kind of notoriety, a certain kind of fame. He was a star of stage and screen. And coming back to the United States, he found himself in sync with the political environment, particularly after Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, December 1941. The United States enters World War II. Robeson becomes a major figure helping to generate support in the Black community for the United States effort, which was no minor matter, because as I talk about in my book, Facing the Rising Sun, there was a very strong pro-Tokyo movement amongst Black Americans that Robeson had to overcome. So in any case, he was celebrated until 1945. World War II ends. The United States turns on its former ally. Speaking of the Soviet Union, you have the onset of the Red Scare, anti-communism, bedeviling of socialists, bedeviling of those perceived to be communists. And of course, this leads to Robeson coming under very severe attack. There are attempts to kill him. His passport is seized, disallowing him from leaving the country. He finds it difficult to find concert halls in which to sing and make a living. He's dragged before congressional committees and grilled. And this is the process throughout the 1950s. But as the 1950s unfolds, you see the rise and independence of Ghana, West Africa, under Kwame Nkrumah, circa 1957. And you see that with the rise to independence of African countries, the United States finds it difficult to make an appeal to these African countries as long as African Americans are treated so atrociously. Robeson, like Du Bois, is quite close to Kwame Nkrumah. And so out of this complex of factors, you see that Robeson's passport is returned. And he skedaddles out of the United States almost immediately, but he probably overdoes it in terms of traveling. He travels to Europe. He travels down under to Australia and New Zealand, for example, engaging in acts of solidarity with the indigenous population. What happens is that this exerts wear and tear on this man, who by then is in his 60s. And you may recall that during that period, his wife falls ill. She's his support. She passes away. And so Robeson decides to move back to the United States to live with his sister in West Philadelphia. And he has a kind of internal exile in West Philadelphia. And as the anti-Jim Crow movement erupts in the 1960s, many of the young activists pay fealty to Robeson, but he is in virtual seclusion before passing away in early 1976. And that is the story in capsule and in short of the late, great Paul Robeson.
And that's excellent. And I think what you just highlighted there is something that, especially on my generation, the millennial generation, I believe Paul Robeson is a bit lost. We can look to Malcolm X, we can look to Martin Luther King Jr., and those are our two biggest figures. But in terms of looking at a figure like Paul Robeson, I feel like he's a bit lost and a bit disconnected, particularly from the millennial generation and the generations after. But when you really study this individual and who he was, what he stood for, and the accomplishments he had in his life, you get a sense of not only was he someone who was clearly in opposition to the racism and the conditions of that time, and certainly was a figure, a role model for Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, but he had the international appeal, which Malcolm X, like I believe you mentioned this before, he had a little bit of that. He captured a little bit with his trip to Mecca and so on, but Paul Robeson really had an international understanding and an international reach. And so I want to hit on that a little bit more, because in the book you mention that Paul Robeson mentions that actually that he discovers Africa in London. He meets with the eventual Nigerian independence leader Nnamdi Azikiwe. He meets with Kwame Nkrumah. He meets with Jomo Kenyatta, and he also meets with Indian independence leader Jawaharlal Nehru. So could you discuss Paul's influences that he picked up in London, and also could you describe London at that time, and what influences were there, and what sort of atmosphere did London have at that time?
Well, first of all, during this time, speaking of the 1920s and 1930s, Great Britain was the master of this massive so-called empire that incorporated not only places in the Caribbean like Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago, the nation once known as British Guyana, Antigua, the Bahamas, Bermuda, not only that, but Africa, Nigeria, the continent's giant, South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, etc. And so as a result of the empire, that attracts many of the nationals from the empire to London. You mentioned some of them. I would add to that list that you enumerated, which of course includes Nkrumah, founding father of Ghana, Kenyatta, the founding father of Kenya. I would also add C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian intellectual who is friendly with Robeson. He writes a play about Toussaint Louverture, the Pan-African hero, the embodiment of the Haitian Revolution, in which Robeson stars on the stage in London. And of course, you can find a copy of that text written by C.L.R. James quite easily if one is so inclined, not to mention his still worthy book on the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobins, by the way. And so this is the environment in which Robeson finds himself. But I would also say that part of the key to Robeson's internationalism is something that should be intuitively obvious, but oftentimes is neglected, which is this multilingualism. People appreciate your speaking to them in the tongue that they understand. Robeson, as I say in the book, suggested that if his life and career had not taken the trajectory that it did, he would have been comfortable as a professor of philology, the professor of the philosophy of language at some college or university. When he would go on the road, he would take a small recorder or hi-fi, if you like, where he would listen to languages and study languages. Before a concert in Norway, for example, he began to study the Norwegian language. And I think that because he was able to communicate to so many different people in so many different languages, that attracted people to him. And by implication, it attracted people to his people, that is to say, Black Americans. In his concerts, he would sing in different languages. He sang in Russian and Chinese. He studied African languages. So Robeson, amongst other talents, was an intellectual, that is to say, a person of ideas. Not only, as Nkrumah used to say, not only a man of action, but a man of thought. And I should mention in this context how in 1936, 1937, during the Spanish Civil War, which was a precursor to the rise of fascism, Robeson was on the front lines in solidarity with the left-leaning government in Spain, which ultimately was defeated. You may also know that a number of US nationals, including Black Americans, came to Spain in order to fight the fascists. And in a book that I'm doing now on the rise of armed struggle, as oftentimes embodied in the Black Panther Party, Oakland, arising in 1966, I talk about how a precursor to that were the Black Americans who went to Spain to fight fascism with guns in hand. And then some of these Black Americans, after fighting fascism with guns in hand, then fought fascists in Europe with guns in hand. So this is the militant environment that shapes and ultimately helps to forge the militant political identity of one Paul Robeson.
I see. And could you speak more about Paul Robeson's life in Russia? I know you mentioned that he wanted his son to be educated there. His son spent several years being educated there. So how long did Paul Robeson spend in Russia? He was also fluent in Russian. Could you explain more about his ties with Russia?
Well, he was in and out of Russia quite a bit. And as you suggest, his son, Paul Jr., who I happen to know, he passed away a few years ago. We used to do radio programs on the Pacifica station in New York. You might be able to find some episodes online. But Paul Jr., of course, was fluent in Russian, and the way he made a living while living in New York was translating technical journals from Russian into English. This is an emblem of his stay there. The elder Paul Robeson was in and out of Russia quite a bit. And he was supportive of the Soviet project, not least because, as you probably know, for various reasons, the Soviet Union was backing African liberation. But even before 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, you had Russia with an interest in supporting African liberation because it was in their interest to do so, because their antagonists in Western Europe were getting fat and happy and able to arm themselves because of exploitation of Africa. For example, many of your audience are probably familiar with the Ethiopian defeat of the Italian fascists, the Italian invaders in Ottawa in the 1890s. As I'm going to discuss in a forthcoming book that deals with Ethiopia and Egypt and their relationship to the United States, one of the reasons why the Abyssinians, the Ethiopians, were able to defeat the Italian invaders in the 1890s is because they were armed to the teeth by pre-revolutionary Russia. This is before 1917. And so part of the contradiction that is oftentimes not grasped, I'm afraid to say, is that a contradiction of European history and European politics is that many of these smaller nations, like Britain, population today of 65 million, and France, a similar population, Germany, a population of 82 million. Even today, Russia has a population of about 150 million. During the Soviet era, when it also incorporated the Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, when it incorporated Central Asian republics such as Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, et cetera, it had a population of 250 million. And so Russia historically has been the giant of Europe, but the Western European powers who had gotten fat on colonialism and the African slave trade were not necessarily the major force in their backyard, speaking of Europe. And so this leads to repeated attempts, such as 200 years ago when Napoleon sought to invade Russia and was defeated handily. And then you saw Britain and France gang up on Russia in the Crimean War of the 1850s. You saw that in 1905, Britain supported Japan. It was so desperate that it supported Japan in its attack on Russia, which is a turning point in world history, as Du Bois and Nehru and Ho Chi Minh pointed out, because it was one of those rare events when an Asian nation, speaking of Japan, defeats a European nation. And this unleashes a chain of events that ultimately not only leads to the Russian Revolution in 1917, but also it strengthens Japan, which then makes appeals to Black Americans. All this stemming from this hysteria in Western Europe about the rise of Russia and the potency of Russia. This is something that the Black intellectuals like Robeson and Du Bois were well familiar with. Sadly, what's happened in recent decades is that many Black intellectuals, leaders, and organizations, they paid little or no attention to events outside of the United States of America. Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily have a position on the Ukraine conflict. If they do, it's basically tailing after Biden's position, for example. They haven't even paid attention to the rise of China, which I've written about voluminously and is one of the most significant events over the past few hundred years. This is a result of the fact that a deal was cut in the 1950s, whereby the US ruling elite turns to the Black community and says, you folks can get anti-Jim Crow concessions, but you really got to turn away from the international community. Robeson and Du Bois, in the first instance, were reluctant to accept that bargain. Du Bois was indicted at the age of 83, circa 1950, 1951, barely escaped prison. He was charged with being an agent of a foreign power, meaning the Soviet Union. I already talked about the persecution of Robeson during that same time for similar political reasons. And since that bargain was made, you've had many of our leaders, intellectuals, organizations, they've been missing in action with regard to international matters. And I think that's one of the many reasons why our community has suffered so grievously over the recent decades.
Yes, indeed. I would agree with that. And I would definitely say that, we certainly have a limited international scope, like you mentioned. And that kind of makes me want to switch gears to Paul Robeson's life as an actor, because I think that kind of has a legacy in and of itself, especially his play of Othello, especially if people really think deeply about Othello. And you mentioned in the book that, many of the romantic scenes that he would play in London would cause violent eruption in the US. And you kind of, that made me think of a lot of different things, and kind of building off what you were saying before, it appears that, especially in today's times, there's kind of an opposite trend, at least that we see in popular media and commercials and so on, to show more interracial relationships and so on. But you could argue that there is an underlying counter trend. Maybe it could be manifested in the Tea Party movement, or manifested a bit in the Trump supporters or Trump following. And that kind of made me think deeply about the role of Iago, kind of, Du Bois's double consciousness, that kind of voice of doubt in your head that, really, they don't really accept you, or you're not really a part of this, or, sort of exposing maybe the fears, deep inside the consciousness. And so I would say, in today's time, the overt white supremacy is gone, which maybe, causes people to turn away from that international, making the international appeal. But I still believe there's definitely a spectrum of feelings that people have, internal feelings that people have regarding racism. And I guess, how does the modern African-American, navigate this sort of reality, especially in light of the legacy of Paul Robeson, who had an international outlook on his approach to life, saw the alternatives available to where African Americans could live to find greater liberty, greater treatment as an individual. And one thing stuck with me that Robeson mentioned in the book is that when he initially played Othello, he played him as the Negro because that's what naturally came out of him.
Mhm.
But eventually he began to see Othello and play him as a foreigner in a foreign land. And
Mhm.
that made me think, is that truly the state that we as African Americans or African American people, is that the state that they're in today? Is that truly they're foreign people in a foreign land? And what is the best way to cope with that, and how can we follow Robeson's legacy in doing that?
Well, those are very complex thoughts, my friend, that you're putting forward, but let me try to grapple with them. One of the themes that I've tried to put forward in some of my works on slavery dovetails with your idea of seeing Black people as strangers in a strange land, to cite that science fiction novel of some years ago, the title, that is. That is to say that despite the protestations to the contrary of some of our friends in the liberal community, for example, uh, those who founded the United States in 1776 did not necessarily contemplate that Black people would either A, be free, or certainly not full citizens. If you look at the Constitution, for example, which is heralded as this great leap forward for humanity, I'm sure you're familiar with the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, familiar with the Fugitive Slave Clause, familiar with the Second Amendment, which was basically a way to organize militias and slave patrols, not only to keep enslaved Africans in line, but to pulverize and punish the indigenous population, who, by the way, oftentimes tried to forge alliances with the enslaved population. And so it has been an uphill climb for Black people in this continent. But to reiterate, I think to the extent that we have been able to make progress, oftentimes it's been through these international alliances, which are largely absent today. That is to say, with regard to the Black leadership, intellectuals, organizations. Certainly, Robeson's portrayal of Othello, as your comment suggests, is quite illustrative. That is to say, not only in terms of his being reluctant to be as expressive with Desdemona, the European woman with which he is tied, on the stage in New York, Broadway, in the early 1940s, because on the stage, he had a fear that somebody might rush the stage and might punch him out or even attack him physically because of his intimacies, so to speak, with Desdemona, which brings us to today. And I think that despite the interracial relationships that you see portrayed on television or in commercials, I don't think that you can separate that from the fact that this sort of relationship is not necessarily, shall we say, embraced universally by many. You mentioned the Tea Party, forces to their right, for example. Matter of fact, it may be helping to generate the kind of naked white supremacy that has become so emblematic and so prevalent in the United States today. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we study the life and legacy of the late, great Paul Robeson, so that we can gain insight into these particular dilemmas that we're confronting today.
Yes, I think that's well said. And you hit a valid point in that the African American community, or the African American people within the American continent, they don't have the international focus to see the positive alliances that are happening in the world, such as the great developments that are happening. You mentioned the rise of China and how China is actually investing many dollars. I was in Africa not very long ago,
What part?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, yeah, Addis Ababa. And a large part of the building, the construction, the investment has come from Chinese dollars, actually, and they have an actually very positive outlook of Chinese people, of Chinese money and Chinese investment. Um, so there's certainly uh, great alliances that can be built with other peoples. It's just a matter of seeing it. And so yeah, I think another question I had, sort of relating to that is what was interesting was the petition that
Mhm,
Paul
mhm,
Robeson filed in the United Nations, charging the United States with genocide against African Americans. Actually, I remember Malcolm X speaking about this during one of his speeches.
mhm.
That this is an action that African Americans should do. We should take this international, take our suit to the United Nations now. In today's time, I don't know how effective going to the United Nations would be, considering United Nations is controlled predominantly by the United States. Um, but definitely, making that international appeal is what I think they were stressing. Um, so I guess, obviously there's a lack of that voice. Um, what would you say is to how do we regain that voice? How do we, continue to look beyond the borders of America? How do we get that type of consciousness out to African Americans at large?
Well, it's very interesting with regard to Africa. As you know, in a few days, there will be a major summit in Washington, D.C. Between the U.S. administration and heads of state and government from the African continent. This bespeaks the issue you just raised. There's a lot of hysteria in Washington right now about China's role in Africa, and that helps to explain this summit that's taking place in Washington. It also sheds light on why the Biden administration just a few days ago suggested that the African Union, which is headquartered in Ethiopia, this is the Pan-African body that incorporates the 4 dozen plus African nations, that it have a permanent seat at the table at the Group of 20 meetings. The Group of 20, of course, are the leading forces on planet Earth. They just met in Bali, Indonesia, a few days ago, as you probably know. Mr. Biden, and there are those in Washington as well, have suggested that with regard to the United Nations, that the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council who got that exalted position as a result of World War II, speaking of the United States, China, Moscow, Britain, France, that there be African representation. And I think that this is not some sort of charity on the part of the United States. They're hysterical about China. And we should try to take advantage of that. You mentioned the petition that Robeson was involved with in circa 1950 with his good friend, William L. Patterson, who I mentioned a moment or two ago, who helped to guide Robeson on his political journey. That was exceedingly important because it put Washington in the dock at a time when it was trying to portray itself as a paragon of human rights virtue. Here you have these Black people coming along and saying, no, these people have countenanced lynching. They've countenanced all manner of bestiality against Black people. And needless to say, Robeson and Patterson paid a stiff price because of their temerity in bringing this powerful nation before the international community and placing it in disrepute. But despite the fact that the United States still wields significant influence at the United Nations, I don't think we should ignore the fact that as many of our friends in the Black Lives Matter movement have been doing, that we need to encourage the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, headquartered in Geneva, to investigate the human rights violations in the United States, the police killings, George Floyd, Michael Brown, all the rest, that the International Commission of Jurists and other international bodies should be investigating the United States. I think we need to keep that kind of pressure on. And the problem, I think, is that there's not enough of that kind of pressure, that many of our organizations and leaders are not thinking globally. And as a result, they're missing the boat. And I think that they're leaving victories on the table.
Yes, that's well said. And, I definitely agree with you. And it's sort of what I'm taking from uh, reading about Paul Robeson and discussing him during this, dialogue is that what we can learn from Paul Robeson is to see the world from an international perspective. Be open to learning languages, be open to learning cultures, be open to taking your issues to the international sphere if you want to get any real change done as well. So I think that's definitely what I'm taking from it, and I appreciate you taking the time to discuss Paul Robeson here on the True Dialogue Show. It's been a great pleasure to have this full-length discussion with you. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.